The year is 1959. Chevy takes a totally different outside the box approach when building their new engine for their new line of cars, taking a page out of Volkswagen and Porsche. I'm sorry, I do say Porsche, not Porsche, because most people that say Porsche sound like total douches. Just saying, with an air-cooled, flat as a pancake opposing engine. But not just that, it was rear mounted and was to power Chevy's all new, brand new line of cars, Corvair. The engine was to go by many different names: Corvair engine, Pancake 6, Turbo Air 6. Despite the engine, most of these engines did not use a turbocharger, but one did, which we'll get to later. Introduced in 1959 for the 1960 model year and would be produced until 1969. It was available in 3 displacements: 140, 145, 164. This engine featured a 3-piece aluminum crankcase with cast iron cylinder barrels and aluminum heads, overhead valves set up with push rods, hydraulic tappets, 4 main bearings. This engine was flat as a pancake, opposing cylinder configuration. Engine was air-cooled, and it was done by a shrouded cooling fan mounted horizontally on top of the engine. The fans were modified through production run. Early fans were steel. Years later, they used magnesium, which reduced inertia. The fan is driven by a long V-belt with adjustable pulley. The belt makes 2 90-degree turns. Early cars liked to throw belts. A groove was inserted into the pulley to correct the issue. The engine was also cooled by engine oil. Cast iron camshaft located in the crankcase. The shaft only has 9 lobes. The symmetrical arrangement allows 3 double-width cam lobes to operate all 6 exhaust valves. Full lubrication to all moving parts and pressurized from main oil galleries to crank and camshaft bearings. The Corvair project was led by Ed Cole. Introduced in 1959 for the 1960 model year, 140 cubic inch displacement, opposing Pancake 6, 2.3 liters. It's good for 80 or 95 horsepower with a special camshaft at 4,400 RPM, 125 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM, with a bore of 3.375 inches and a stroke of 2.6 inches. Compression was 8-to-1. This engine used a cooling fan 11 inches in diameter with a 24-blade cooling fan. This engine also does not have a harmonic balancer on the front of it. It was only used in 1960. It's important to note, every year they do changes to the engine. We're not going to get into every single change, but we're going to talk about some highlights. And after 1961, they offered many different flavors of these engines. In 1961, Zora Arcus Duntov, ever heard of him? Got involved by increasing displacement, but also he revised the cylinder head and the camshaft, bringing displacement up to 145 cubic inch displacement. Pancake 6. 2.4 liters is good for anywhere between 80 to 98 horsepower, 4,600 RPM, 132 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM, with a bore of 3.5 inches and a stroke of 2.6 inches. Compression is 8-to-1. The cooling fan shrunk to 10.7 inches with 16 vanes. Years this engine was used is a bit conflicting, but 1961 to 1964. 1962 saw some changes and different versions/flavors. Standard engine was 80 horsepower, 128 pound-feet of torque with 8-to-1 compression. Another version was coupled to a 2-speed power glide. Compression increased to 9-to-1, 84 horsepower, 130 pound-feet of torque. The Super Turbo Air, which is not turbocharged, made 102 horsepower, 4,400 RPM, 134 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM. The carbs are now equipped with automatic chokes. Prior, they had manual chokes. In March of 1962, Chevy announced a turbocharged version. It's important to note the turbo version wasn't like turbos that they put on cars today. It was a low boost system. The turbo was called the Spider, and it was offered from 1962 to 1964. And then they did a total update on the Corvair, getting rid of the swing axle, going to independent suspension on all 4 corners, and they called it Corsa. The turbocharger was offered on the Corsa from 1965 and 1966. 66 being the last year it was dropped in 67. And here's where things get a little bit tricky. Between the years of 62 and 63, the turbo car was called the Monza Spider. It used the 145 cubic inch displacement engine. In 64, they went to a bigger displacement engine, 164 cubic inch displacement. It made the same power, but the power came on quicker at 4,000 RPM. Chevy would increase power output of the turbo engine in 1965 and 66. It was good for anywhere between 180 to 190 horsepower at 4,000 RPM, 265 pound-feet of torque at 3,200 RPM. And to make things even more confusing, from 1962 to 1964, the turbocharged car was called the Monza Spider. That's easy enough, right? So in 1965 through 66, Monza became the basement model. Corsa was the top model. But Corsa for 65 and 66 had two different engine options. You could either get the 4-carb 140 horsepower version or the turbo. So just because you have a Corsa doesn't mean it's a turbo car. In 1964, displacement grew to 164 cubic inch displacement by increasing stroke size to 2.94 inches. Compression also grew. In the base version and the turbo version, it was 825 to 1 and 925 to 1 in the hypo version. 164 cubic inch displacement, pancake 6, 2.7 liters. This engine was good for 95 horsepower all the way up to 190 horsepower in the turbocharged variants at 4,000 RPM, 232 pound-feet to 265 pound-feet at 3,200 RPM. With a bore of 3.4 inches and a stroke of 2.9 inches, gears 1964 to 1969, the harmonic balancer was added to all of the engines except for the base engine. There is a 140 horsepower version in the mix that's worth talking about. It makes 140 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, 160 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM. It used a different cylinder head, larger valves, dual exhaust, larger intake manifolds, 4 carburetors, so you can't just add 2 more carburetors to the base engine. It also used the same forged chromium steel crankshaft the turbo engines used, and this was the base Corsa engine. We can't talk about Corvair without mentioning they had a higher performance version built by Yenko, Don Yenko, who was a Pennsylvania car dealer, best known for stuffing 427 big blocks into Camaros. Think Carroll Shelby of Chevy, but that's a bit of a stretch, but I guess if you look at it through the lens of performance cars, selling it through a dealership, maybe. Yenko made Corvairs from 1966 to 1969 in very small/limited numbers in stages 1 through 4. Stage 1 was 20 horsepower bump over the 140 horsepower version, making 160 horsepower. He tuned the carbs. He added moraine connecting rods and bearings, 7-quart finned aluminum oil pan, and a fan belt tensioner. Phase 2 pushed horsepower up to 190 horsepower with a hypo camshaft, heavy-duty valve springs, modified pistons, polished crankshaft, increased compression to 10 to 1, and also included a lightweight flywheel. Stage 3 was everything just mentioned, plus ported and polished cylinder heads, forged pistons, high-performance distributor, increased compression 10.5 to 1, and it got 220 horsepower. The final stage was stage 4, and it made 240 horsepower. It's worth noting, all of this was done without a supercharger, and this one was strictly built for the track. It's believed Don Yenko built 115 Yenko Corvairs between the years of 1966 and 1969, 100 of which were built in 1966 alone, so they could race in SCCA. They also modified at least 30 customer cars for a total of somewhere around 145 cars, making the Yenko Corvair one of the rarest Corvairs. There are tons of tributes out there, so just be aware. It's also worth mentioning the Corvair engine was also used in marine and aircraft applications due to the fact of how light the engine was. A lot of people think Ralph Nader was the end of the Corvair, which really isn't true. Unsafe at Any Speed came out in 1965, and by that time, Corvair did away with the swing axle going independent suspension. They would produce the Corvair until 1969. That book did not kill the car. It wasn't like the head of Binance sending a tweet and bankrupting a $30 billion crypto company overnight. Too soon? There was two major contributing factors as to why it didn't live on. And I guess a third one, you could say emissions would have killed it eventually, but emissions weren't really that bad in 1968-69. They got really bad in 72. The engines were largely produced of aluminum and they were expensive to produce, but ultimately it was the buying public. They bought Falcons and Mustangs and Chevy 2s and Valiants instead of Corvairs. All right. Now it's time for Would You Rather, two scenarios today. In the first scenario, would you rather have a 1961 Corvair or a 1961 Corvair Lakewood wagon or 1961 Greenbrier van slash truck? I am going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario, 1964 Corvair Spider or 1966 Corsa Turbo or 1966 Stage 2 Yenko. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below. I read and answer all comments posted. And I don't say that for self-worth. I just say that to just let you know that I do read and answer everything posted. And that's the way it will always be, because I try to run this channel as a car community that I am very much a part of. We also have a Facebook group that correlates with this YouTube channel I call the After Party. If you'd like to send something more intimate, send me a message through email, all of which will be linked in the description below. Just know I really do appreciate everything that you guys bring in the comment section below. And until next time, toodaloo! Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said? What was that promise that you made? Now I'm gonna love you till the heavens stop the rain.